to the place in the middle of the sun. And we'll sing this song, sing it one by one.
Hey, Love Tribe.
What's going on, guys? Thank you for tuning in to today's show. Today, we welcome Dr. Chris Dwyer.
And Chris is a post-doctoral researcher in the School of Health Sciences and lecturer in the Center for Adult Learning and Professional Development at the National University of Ireland. And he is also the author of Critical Thinking, Conceptual Perspectives, and Practical Guidelines, published by Cambridge University Press.
And today we talk about critical thinking. And obviously, this is a very important part of our lives and something that we can cultivate, and really now more than ever, something important to have with the amount of knowledge and information that is thrown at us every day, and certainly during pandemic times and these political times. And really individually and in our relationships, it's important to cultivate this skill. And Dr. Dwyer talks about how we can do this and why we need to realize that we just don't know everything. And maybe you have a partner who seems like they always want to dig their heels in and defend their position like they know everything. And that can be extremely frustrating. And Dr. Dwyer talks about how we can think about that situation and, I don't want to say deal with it, but navigate it with our partner and develop critical thinking together.
So we hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. And as always, we hope you guys enjoy today's episode. And we would love for you guys to check out our website. We have a ton of free resources on there, including our 14-day Happy Couple Challenge, all the information about our course, as well as a ton of free guides that are linked up with a lot of the episodes that we've done in the past. So we hope you guys check that out and enjoy today's show. Today's show is brought to you by our online course, Spark My Relationship. Create more passion, improve your communication, and build a stronger, more intimate connection with your partner in less than 90 days. We've collaborated with 15 therapists and psychologists to bring you the strategies marriage therapists teach their clients. To unlock a special offer only for I Do Podcast listeners, visit sparkmyrelationship.com/unlock. That's sparkmyrelationship.com/unlock. Hi, Chris. Thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
No problem, Sarah. Thanks very much for having me.
Chris, today we're going to talk about an area that you've written a book on, doing research on, and that we think is important for, and I'm sure you do as well, obviously, for all aspects of life, and that is critical thinking. And there's a lot of directions we could go with this conversation, and we're excited to learn about your research. And obviously, being a relationship advice podcast, we want to learn how we can develop this skill of critical thinking, share it with our partner, maybe if our partner's not engaging in it as much as maybe they could, and just use it as a tool to move through life in a better way. So let's start by having you tell us how you think of critical thinking and how, through your research, you've seen us be able to develop it as a practice.
That's a great question, Chase. Thanks very much. How do we develop it? It's one of those things that, it really comes down to not age or intelligence or anything like that, really. But, even though they play a role, it's really about, being presented opportunities to engage in critical thinking and taking those opportunities and practicing. It sounds like a cliche, but the practice of critical thinking is very important. And, it's one of those things as well that even if you get really good at critical thinking, there's going to be topics that arise that, spur in you some kind of emotional reaction, I guess, where, you might bypass that critical thinking and you might, just kind of make decisions based on emotion. And that's one of the large problems that we might see in the world today, this kind of lack of critical thinking, I guess, is kind of a criticism in terms of people just, kind of act and make statements based on gut feelings, which, is the complete, polar opposite of critical thinking. So it's really about, taking opportunities that you recognize need critical thinking and taking your time to kind of reflect on the variables in the situation and really consider them, to make as best a solution or decision as you can.
So I think you just answered my question. It was a very basic one of, could you tell us the difference between critical thinking and just thinking? But I think you explained at the very end of really taking the time to think about something and process it before you decide. Is that a good way to explain it simply?
Yeah, it's a nice one. It's a clear one. But it is largely about taking time. Is there more to it than that? In some ways, yes. In some ways that, it's about acknowledging the way I think, the two simplest ways I can kind of describe it is, number one, taking it for, I don't want to say taking it for granted, because we shouldn't take anything for granted, but taking for granted that you don't know everything and realizing that there's a certain level of uncertainty to everything. So if you go into a situation saying, I don't know and I want to learn more, well, that's a great kind of disposition that you want to have going into thinking. It's not about being overconfident. It's not about, confidence at all. It's about, I want to learn the truth about something, which is, great. But that's not always necessarily an issue with thinking. If you're asked to think about something, you want to have confidence in your decision making. You want to, have that kind of, that feeling, I guess, that gut feeling like, yeah, okay, I'm done. This is right. The thing about critical thinking, it's the opposite end. You have to realize that you could be wrong, and you have to be open to that potentiality. Now, the other way of describing it, a simpler way, I guess, is looking at it as playing devil's advocate. So, if you make it, if you're looking at some type of topic and you realize that, it's, like a kind of a 50-50 debate that, people are on one side of the fence or the other, you need to recognize what side of the fence you're on, or what side, your emotions are kind of leaning towards, and then acknowledge that and be honest with yourself about that and say, right, well, I feel this way. Now I need to consider it from the other point of view. So it's looking at both sides of the story and treating them with, with equal respect until, you've critically considered, each side, and then you can make a decision once you've given them both a fair shake, I guess.
Let's dig into why this is not maybe natural or a practice that people are good at, and especially in relationships, because that's how, we think critically individually about things by ourselves, but you've said a couple sentences that just make me think of an intimate relationship where one partner may not be open to the idea that they're wrong. So you're trying to solve a disagreement with, let's say, your partner, and you're not going to get anywhere if the other person can't even be open to the idea that they may not be right. And this is obviously happening all the time in intimate relationships, business relationships, friends, family. So let's really dig into that. And maybe you can tell us what's going on in that moment and the skills we can practice, or maybe how we could communicate with a partner that's not even open to the idea that they're wrong, like how we can start that conversation and then move forward and think more critically.
Yeah. You see, that's a really tough one because, I mentioned a couple of words, emotion being one of them. And, that's kind of a foundational aspect of a relationship, whether it's a good, solid relationship or, it's a tough, relationship that needs work. Emotion is always going to be part of any type of relationship. And then I look at, the way I described critical thinking, before as well. And I just think, in terms of how I act and how I think, and, I try to practice what I preach in terms of critical thinking. And, when I teach classes on it, I say, it's important to do this, play devil's advocate and, look at both sides of the story. But I said, the only time I would recommend not doing that is when I come home from work and I'm having a discussion with my wife, and my wife says, I think we're going to do this. And here I am. And it almost sounds like I'm second guessing her, playing devil's advocate, trying to look at something from both sides, and it's not that I'm questioning her. It's that, I'm working to understand the decision making for myself. So she might say to me, you're acting as if, I haven't already considered this. And of course she's considered it. But, here I am trying to think out loud, trying to, see if I concur with that. And, a good working relationship involves a lot of collaborative decision making. So, there requires, that individual thinking to, kind of ensure that, you're on the same page. So it is tough. And the way in which, I think the way in which we as individuals approach that dialogue is very, very important. So here I am trying to, I'm making the point that it's important to kind of highlight objectivity in decision making and how we, communicate. But at the same rate, we also have to self-regulate ourselves. And I think that's an important aspect of this. Self-regulate the way in which we communicate this kind of objective thinking, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? How we can cultivate that skill of self-regulation?
Yeah. It's, the thing about it is that, I wouldn't say it's an exact science. I wouldn't say, it's a largely experience-based thing. It's about how people can kind of, build a routine, build, a behavior for themselves. The thing about, behavior is that, we engage in behavior, in a routine because it's worked for us in the past. So, if it turns out like, there was a positive outcome in the way in which we've had a conversation with someone, everyone leaves happy, then we're likely to engage in conversations and communication like that again in the future. And, that's probably how, relationships build. That's, how, we strengthen relationships by communicating with each other and ensuring that, this liking, this loving, that happens is reinforced. But the problem is that, that's not always going to happen. We're not always going to like the outcomes of a conversation. So when disagreements, arise and we see that there is disagreement, that's the issue that, we're like, well, I've engaged in this behavior that has otherwise been pretty positive for me. Why is it now becoming negative? So it's almost like the situation is going off script, and, there is a certain element of uncertainty then, because now you're in an argument. You don't understand why, because, this is very much against the routine of what's generally happened in the past. And so I guess, it becomes that the way in which we think and speak and act and everything in those kind of situations becomes very reactive as opposed to thought out, if you get me.
Absolutely. And one of the things you mentioned of just cultivating critical thinking is just the understanding going into a situation or a conversation or a meeting or a museum, the idea that you don't know everything and being open to that. And just, to me, it's like a state of being, but it does need to be practiced, because I feel like I'm pretty open to ideas and things, but then also easily go back into the groove of what's comfortable. And if it's a political ideology, we tend to line up, and if there's a particular political stance in relation to healthcare, you might not even think about it because you just toe the party line. I think that's more common than not, unfortunately. So it's such a valuable skill to develop and work on. How can someone individually, some exercises or some things to think about rather than just, obviously just thinking about this, bringing it to people's attention, but maybe something that you tell yourself to be open to the idea that you're wrong in the moment. And then, and again, going back to if we have a partner who it just seems like they're always digging their heels in and just not open to the idea that there's another angle here, how we can work on, they got to do it for themselves, but how we can communicate with them to try to see that there's another side here.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, really. The fact is that it's hard enough to manage our own thinking, and it's hard enough to manage all the kind of variables that can impede our thinking. So like emotion getting involved. And like I said, before, how when we go off script, we get very reactive. And, when we get very reactive, emotion kind of creeps in, and then, our thinking becomes very emotion led. And, that's probably when fights start and arguments start and voices get raised and the like. And that's problematic, but it's difficult enough to control your own emotion and your own thinking and trying your best, where, trying to, in any way, shape or form, trying to manipulate, that of your partners, I think would be incredibly difficult. But the fact is that I think if this is something, if a topic arises that you both care about, I think that's one of the points that needs to be made first, that, listen, we both really care about this. We may not see eye to eye on every aspect of it, but because we care about it, let's talk about it, in a calm, collected manner. And I think by reinforcing that concept of cool, calm, collected, that I think that, kind of gives these opportunities, like I said, to engage critical thinking. So, if it's, kind of one of those situations where, you can't agree on something and it always seems to turn into an argument, well, then, something's wrong with the way in which, communication is going. Obviously, not everything should turn into an argument. I think about, my wife and I, and, we don't agree on everything, of course, but, we don't get into, heated arguments about them either. We do sit down and we have, conversations, dialogues. And, sometimes we, one of us will say, I see your point. I understand where you're coming from. And, minds get changed from time to time. It's because I think we make that conscious effort to not let emotion, get, take hold. It's about, letting, or valuing, I guess is a better way of putting it. If you value reasoning and you value logic and you value the concept of actually getting a good solution out of this, then, I think you're more likely to do that. I think, if you have an axe to grind, or, you're mad at your partner for X, Y, or Z from the week before, that may kind of trickle in, so I think it's about kind of, if you're expecting the best out of them in terms of, being open-minded and keeping emotion out of it, then I think, we have to start in our own heads, and we have to say, well, if I want my partner to act that way or react that way, well, then I have to, play the same role. I have to be an example of what I expect. So, I think if one person is cool and calm and, forgets about the sarcasm and forgets about, any kind of emotionally loaded wording, I think, building a routine like that and engaging like that over time, I think will lead to very fruitful conversations.
Before we continue on, we want to tell you about today's sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp.
Is something preventing you from achieving your goals? I was super stressed out with work for a while, and the stress was preventing me from moving forward professionally. Talking through my issues with my BetterHelp counselor really helped me move forward and get on a better path toward my goals.
BetterHelp connects you with a professional counselor from the comfort of your home. You can start communicating with your therapist in under 24 hours, and you can communicate with them via text, chat, phone, and video. You can schedule weekly video or phone sessions, all without ever having to leave your house. It's super convenient and helpful using BetterHelp. Once you use the service, it will be super easy to see why so many people have been using BetterHelp. BetterHelp is growing so much that they have been recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states.
If you're not happy with your counselor for any reason, you can request a new one at any time for no additional charge. BetterHelp is secure, convenient, and professional.
We want you to start living a happier life today. As a listener of the podcast, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/IDO. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/IDO.
This episode is also brought to you by Everplate. Everplate is America's best value meal kit, delivering filling, familiar, pre-measured ingredients with simple recipes directly to your door. And recipes come together in about 30 minutes, which is definitely faster than a trip to the grocery store or trying to organize all the ingredients for a new meal from scratch. That's definitely not my specialty. Not only are Everplate's meals delicious and easy to prepare, but they're also super affordable. Even at full regular price, Everplate is up to 58% cheaper than other major meal kits out there.
Less time deciding what to cook means more time spent enjoying good food with family and friends. And Everplate's easy to follow recipes and pre-portioned ingredients take the stress out of dinner time. And we all know that a stress-free dinner time with hungry kiddos or a hungry husband or wife is worth $1 million. Stella and I actually cooked the French onion chicken recipe last night, and it was so delicious. It was paired with roasted carrots, which Stella loves. So since she helped me make the recipe, she ate the whole entire plate, which it was so good. I know she probably would have eaten the whole plate anyway. So get 3 weeks of Everyplate meals for only $2.99 per meal by going to everyplate.com and entering the code IDO3. Get 3 weeks of Everyplate meals for only $2.99 per meal by going to everyplate.com and entering the code IDO3. Have you ever found in your research that somebody who is trying to really practice critical thinking almost crosses the line a little bit and uses that as a way to kind of convince people that they're not thinking properly and that, you know, they should change their beliefs based on the fact that they've really been critical in their thinking?
Yeah, well, that's one of the biggest issues going around right now, I think. I don't know if you're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, but it's more or less that people have a tendency to rate themselves higher in kind of competencies like intelligence and critical thinking and like that kind of thinking, or in other kind of skill-based kind of scenarios. They think they're better than they actually are. And the people who are actually very skilled in those areas actually, underestimate themselves. So the fact is, if someone thinks that they're a very good critical thinker, the chances are they're not a very good critical thinker. The best critical thinkers are the quiet ones who say nothing and express their points of view in logical ways and show that uncertainty. Again, it's that idea of I'm trying to learn something here. That's a critical thinker. They want to draw a reasonable conclusion. And so, they'll investigate, they'll do the appropriate research and they remain open-minded, like knowledge changes over time. Like I grew up, with, being told in school that we have 9 planets, and now, as the past few years, we actually have 8 planets. And I think there's, I think that's an amazing kind of starting point for explaining, what we have is critical thinking. I think you have two different types of people in the world, how they react to that news. You have the type of people who kind of say, what's wrong with scientists? They can't even count right. Is it 8 or is it 9? What's going on here? Scientists know nothing. And, this is all a load of, rubbish. Why can't we just get the answers? And then you have on the other end, people who say, how great science is and how it's adapting and changing every day. And because of greater understanding of how things are working, and the relevant sciences involved, that we're able to say, actually, it's 8 planets, and this what we thought was a 9th one is actually something else, a dwarf planet, or whatever kind of terminology you want to use. So I think it kind of comes down to that. It's that kind of, what do you value? What do you look for? Do you aim to think critically just to be right? Just to, kind of show off how smart you are? Or, are you critically thinking because you want to learn and you want to make the best decisions possible for, yourself and your family,
What are some tools to maybe, besides just the mindset, are there any exercises, or like that example you just gave of like thinking about how we react to new knowledge? And this is something you address in your book, but like now more than ever, there's obviously more and more research, science is discovering things, we're learning things in all aspects of our worlds, and that information is more available than ever. And within that, there's misinformation. And this is right. So it's like, and that's why critical thinking is seems to be more important than ever. So just that example you gave with the planets, maybe someone listening can model that, like, as like, okay, like maybe I would criticize the science and say, oh, they don't even know what is what. Are there specific ways to cultivate that? And I'm thinking, especially with kids, it's so important. And I'm going on here, but how much of critical thinking is genetic or nature versus nurture? I feel like if we're cultivating that in our kids early on, that's such a valuable tool to give them.
Yeah, absolutely. Critical thinking is one of those things that there are a number of predictors around that, and they're both nature, both nurture. There's a lot of research that shows that, there's a correlation between critical thinking and having like kind of higher analytic skills, cognitive skills, higher IQ, that kind of thing. But it is very much, nurture as well. Education is, a phenomenal predictor of critical thinking. Reading and all the things that we would equate with, a very traditional way of thinking about intelligence. And, we often look, when we think about genetics and genetic influences, we often look at, parents, it's like, oh, well, were the parents intelligent? And, do they value a good education and reading and intellectual activities and the like? But the fact is, yeah, you can look at it genetically, but if those parents value those kind of things and they themselves made a point of educating themselves, it's likely that's what they're going to provide for their children as well. So, it's not so much a genetic influence as much as it is, a nurture influence in that regard. It's both, So the fact is that it really comes down to that kind of disposition. There is a value element there of, just because, someone is very intelligent, doesn't guarantee that they're going to say to themselves, well, maybe I don't know. Maybe having a higher intelligence will make you more confident, arrogant, even in terms of, what you actually know. So, there's a lot to be said for this, concept of I guess, intellectual modesty, intellectual humility. And I think that's kind of one of those problematic things in this day and age. I think you kind of alluded to that with respect to this kind of what I call the new knowledge economy, which, has been around now 20 years since the real kickoff of mass availability or mass access to the internet. And that there's a lot of misinformation. And the fact is people have a tendency to just jump to the gun with a lot of information that they receive. And maybe it's because, and I am speculating here. But there's an element of I guess we see it in social media. You want to be the first person to post this. You want to be, you want people to like whatever you posted and share what you posted and thumbs up and this and that. There's an element of urgency to that, I think. And because of that urgency, maybe you're not afforded that time to go look up this information and actually corroborate whether or not it's legitimate. And so, maybe that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of misinformation. Of course, there's a lot of, emotionally toned information out there as well. But, there's so many factors that play into whether or not critical thinking is going to be engaged. So going back to this idea of, what predicts critical thinking, obviously, intelligence and certain kind of genetic factors there. But then again, nurture factors there, but that doesn't mean that, that's a predictor of critical thinking there. But that doesn't guarantee that critical thinker is going to think critically in each and every situation. Because if that was the case, then we'd have people out there who don't make mistakes. And that's just, that's not realistic.
What would you tell someone? And I know you mentioned this a little bit, but that it really starts with ourselves and taking this perspective. But in a relationship, how can we communicate with the partner? Or let's say, hey, I listened to this podcast on critical thinking and it got me thinking about how I want to cultivate it in my life. And the other person is just adamant, right? Like the Dunning-Kruger effect is going on and cognitive biases and all these things. And they're digging their heels in and they're just like, I don't need to do anything different. I'm good. How can we get through to them? Like, and obviously they got to do that themselves, but what are some ways to subtly communicate and get them to try to start to think critically?
I think it's kind of, I think there's an important aspect of, I don't think you can practice it in collaboration if your partner doesn't want to collaborate, I don't think you can force it on someone, but I think it's one of those things that if you want to, kind of enhance it in your own life, you can certainly use opportunities. You can certainly use opportunities with your partner to practice for yourself. And maybe, I don't want to say they'll rub off, but like, I think there's an element of things kind of organically working out in that regard. So, like my wife and I have been together for 12 years. We started going out when I was just started my PhD, and things were different then. Young love and everything was about fun, and still very much kids in a way in our early 20s, and didn't take anything too seriously. But over 12 years, we're married now. We have a little girl, all that, real life has gotten in the way. We have jobs and, practical realities of life. And, I think a lot of critical thinking, I guess, as I was saying, sometimes it's an occupational hazard for me, but because I'm interested in it, my wife is interested in it, and we talk about it, and we talk about topics that, are important or that we care about. And we sit down and we converse about it, but we don't say, okay, we need to sit down and think critically about it. It should be something that becomes part of the routine. It shouldn't be something that we have to say, oh, let's put our critical thinking hats on. If you care about a topic, if you care about an issue, that critical thinking should be happening, it should be coming about in itself. And, you can recognize when it's happening, hopefully, with that, it's not something that, happens kind of mindlessly. It is something that you have to engage, but I think when you really care about a topic and you know a reasonable solution needs to be derived, I think you're more inclined to kind of leave emotion out of it and say, hey, listen, we need to get this right because there's a lot riding on it. So I think, again, it's tough. I don't think you can push it on your partner, but I think if you try and enhance it for yourself and you can become that example, I think it becomes part of that relationship dynamic. And regardless of whether or not they want to, start practicing critical thinking, I think it kind of just organically happens on its own, or so we hope.
Yeah. And I think there is a lot of value. Obviously, we can't force this on other people. So I knew there's not like some magic pill you give to your partner and suddenly they're open to it. But like a lot of things, just bringing up the idea or listening to this podcast, there's not like an easy fix of like, hey, here's how you start critically thinking. But you just start thinking about critically thinking, it seems like, and taking that perspective into our life and constantly reminding ourselves. And before we wrap up, I want to ask you, like, for the societal implications of the lack of critical thinking on all political sides, and then combined with the bubbles created through the media and social media that just reinforce people's existing ideas. And it seems like a rabbit hole we're going down, and that there's not a lot of light on the tunnel to get people to open up and see different sides. So through your research and everything you're seeing, what do you think needs to happen in order to move forward in a healthier way where people are becoming more open to new ideas that don't maybe already fall into their existing paradigms?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, again, there is no simple solution. And, what I would kind of recommend is not, it's not an easy fix. It's something that, that takes time. And I think anyone who kind of tries to sell this idea of, 7 easy steps for thinking critically, they're trying to sell something, you know what I mean? So there is no easy fix. But what I've been kind of seeing as problematic here is that it seems to me in the past 30 years or so, and, I was politically minded, when I was in my teen years. I found it very interesting, the whole concept of political party and different sides and the like. And what always struck me was that, I would always jump between, and I would say, oh, well, I like some of these ideas, but, I like some of these ideas on the other side. And a lot of the, peers I had and a lot of adults that I spoke with, I remember that during those times that, no one really seemed terribly extreme one way or the other, right or left, or, whatever kind of party or whatever you're thinking about. But it seems that it's become very extreme these days, that, the right is trying to eat the left and the left is trying to eat the right. And there's no kind of, there's no compromise. There's no middle ground anymore, it seems to me. And maybe there is, but, maybe there are people in the middle, and it just seems that maybe they're not the ones talking, and maybe they are the ones doing the critical thinking. But the fact is that if the right was correct or the left was correct, it doesn't matter, because you see, the thing about politics is that no one's definitely right, because if one side was definitely correct, then politics would cease to exist. The notion of actually having politics shows us that there's different perspectives on how government can or should be, or whatever you want to say should be run. But the fact is that everyone values something different. And again, it's kind of down to this idea of value. And if we can kind of say to ourselves, well, I value this and I value that, well, you know what? Everyone's going to have a slight variance in their values. And, everyone, we have to say to ourselves, is different. We have to kind of respect that, in the sense that, I am just one individual out of how many millions, billions, out there. And, I have to account for those other perspectives. And that's the tough thing in this day and age, is that everyone is just assuming that people are with me or they're against me and there's no middle ground. Well, no, I think, we have to treat kind of politics and this kind of, whatever network we have out there as that everyone's trying to ensure that, everyone gets on well. Obviously there's more individualist perspectives, there's more collectivist perspectives, but the fact is that, everyone's trying to, achieve something. Do you know what I mean? So, I guess the way of looking at it is that if we stay a bit open-minded, we're a little bit more open-minded, and we recognize that other people are out there trying just as hard as we are to achieve similar goals. What's the harm kind of thing? Like, we're all trying our best here. Let's work together. Let's open a dialogue. Let's speak. Let's talk about it. And that's what politics struck me as, 20, 30 years ago. I think, there was more opportunities, more willingness to engage in open dialogue like that. And now it just seems like a very kind of closed-minded perspective on things. And I think that's the biggest problem, that no one is willing to play devil's advocate and say, let me look at it from someone else's point of view.
It is an extremely important skill to develop. And thank you for the research you're doing and for highlighting these ideas and, making us think critically about thinking critically.
And that's actually, I love how you describe that. And I know you were winding it up, but that's an important aspect of critical thinking. We call critical thinking a metacognitive process. And that's kind of the foundation of it, that we're thinking about thinking.
Yeah, it's an important thing to do. And if we can cultivate that, we're going to improve our individual lives and improve our relationships. So hopefully this just got people, our listeners, thinking in this framework and developing the skills. So thank you, Chris, so much for coming on. We'll be sure to have the links to your book and your website in our show notes and in the podcast description. And we appreciate your time.
Thanks a million, Chase. Thanks a million, Sarah.
Hey, Love Tribe. We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. As always, all the important links are on the show notes page on our website at idpodcast.com. And while you're over there, we hope you check out our 14-day Happy Couple Challenge, as well as all the free resources we have on our website. And thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.